The kettle was whistling on the range, and steam filled the kitchen. Ida poured some boiling water into the cold and plunged her hands into the sink. She'd only washed a few more cups and left them to drain on the draining board when there was a knock on the front door. It wouldn't be Uncle Arthur and Bonnie already, would it? Anyway, they'd have come straight in the back. She glanced at the clock on the sitting room mantelpiece. Of course, it was getting on for tea time, so Mrs. Allenby would be wanting her cups and saucers back. Ida took off Mum's pinny, slung it over the back of Dad's armchair, and opened the door. Ida Barnes, I believe, said the large woman in a tight grey jacket, a black beret, and pouting bright red lips. Ida felt like she'd swallowed a boulder. We've come for your sister, Bonnie Barnes, said Mrs. Buller, matron of Netterfield Grange. Ida felt her face drop into a wide-eyed, wordless stare, and the boulder dissolve into 100 fluttering moths trapped inside her chest like it was a lampshade. Chop, chop! You're our last call for the day, said a man behind her in a bowler hat and round, horn-rimmed glasses. Words came out of Ida's mouth, but she had no idea where they came from. She's gone to live with my aunt in Swan Bay. Auntie's taken her in. She's part of her family now. Her moth heart beat fast with the hope that the block that Uncle Arthur and Bonnie were growing round was a very big one. Mrs. Buller's eyes narrowed, and her lips puckered red and greasy. Avoiding the matron's gaze, Ida noticed a third person, a much younger woman, looking demurely at the bag she was clutching in both hands. She wore a hat pinned at a fashionable angle that hid some of her face, but under the brim, one lock of hair curled across a naturally rosy cheek. Mrs. Buller breathed out through her nostrils, not unlike Queenie the horse. Oh, that is disappointing. I was very much looking forward to your sister joining our little family. The spectacled man squeezed through the small gap between Mrs. Buller and the door. In that case, Miss Barnes, we'll need some documentation completed. Miss Lovelock? The young woman fumbled inside her bag and pulled out some pieces of paper. The man snatched them and waggled them at Ida. We need confirmation that your sister is safe and well and not begging on the streets. I hope we won't see that sort of behaviour from you either, young lady. He peered at her over his glasses. Ida took the paper. There had to be at least 10 pages to fill in, and the only things she could think of to write with were Bonnie's crayons. We'll need those back tomorrow. Bring them to the town hall and mark them for the attention of myself. That's Wimpole, Mr. Wimpole with an E. Ida heard the chain being pulled on the toilet outside. Oh no, they must be back. Don't bring Bonnie through, she said in her head to Uncle Arthur as loudly as she could. To Mr. Wimpole, as politely as she could, in the circumstances, she said, Thank you very much. Yes, I'll see you get this. If you'll excuse me, I have a lot of washing up to do. And she tried to push the door shut. Uncle Arthur's shoes tapped across the kitchen floor. Mrs. Buller's foot jammed the front door open. I think you have a visitor. Ida tasted the sick in her throat. Ida! I'm here, Uncle Arthur. Ida cut Uncle Arthur off before he could say anything about Bonnie. Please, Bonnie, please don't come running through. Where? Called Uncle Arthur from the kitchen. Ida had to stop him giving the game away. Going to have some tea, yes, she interrupted. Mrs. Buller's eyes were practically shut now. Ida tried to close the door again, but the horrible woman's foot was still in the way. I really do have a lot of cleaning up to do. Very well, said Mrs. Buller. Where did you say your aunt was? Swan Bay. Now, if you'd be so kind, I have to get Mr. Underwood some tea after all his help today. A large hand landed on her shoulder. Ida felt its weight. Everything tickety-boo? Asked Uncle Arthur. Mrs. Buller looked over the top of Ida's head at Uncle Arthur and removed her foot. "Very well," she said, and retreated off the front doorstep. When Mrs. Buller and the council people were on their way, Ida closed the front door and turned to Uncle Arthur. "I told them she's gone to an auntie's. Would you like some more tea?" She thought she'd better ask. "No, no, no. I should be going too." He reached round her and rested his hand on the front doorknob. "Oh, your hat." Ida fetched the sombre top hat off the kitchen table. "Of course, thank you." Uncle Arthur opened the front door and lowered his head to go through. "Well, goodbye, Ida," he said as he stood on the doorstep and tapped his hat firmly onto his head. "Thank you for everything today, Uncle Arthur," she said. In Camellia Lane there was no sign of Mrs. Buller or the people from the council. They'd gone. She closed the door after Uncle Arthur and with a sigh remembered the washing up. She did wonder what he'd done with Queenie, but as he had people who worked for him, she guessed it was all under control. He was that sort of man. Ida picked up Mum's pinny off Dad's chair and put it back on. She was tying it up when she realised that Bonnie had not come in yet. She wasn't stuck in the lav again, was she? If she was, at least that kept her safe from Mrs. Buller. In the backyard, the lav door was swinging open. Ida pushed it shut and carefully fastened the latch. The back gate was open too. Where Queenie had been harnessed up to the little cart, a familiar-looking maroon Austin Ruby was now parked. Mrs. Buller smiled smugly through the passenger window while Mr. Wimpole and the quiet young woman sat on the back seat. And squashed between them was Bonnie. Ida's heart plunged to Mum's slippers. A young man sat in the driver's seat. At first Ida thought it was Alf, but this one was older and larger. He switched on the headlamps and flooded the alley with light. Bonnie leaned across the young woman and banged on the window. "Ida, I don't want to go!" The young woman looked down into her lap like she was pretending none of this was happening. I know! Ida tried the handle, but it was locked. "Bonnie, I'm coming!" She ran round the other side, but that was locked too. Mr. Wimpole stared straight ahead. Mrs. Buller wound down her window. "We have your sister's best interests at heart," she said, every word curling round her blood-red lips. "You didn't think I was fooled by that Swan Bay aunt tale, did you?" "You can't take her. I'm old enough to look after her, aren't I? I'm 14. "No, you're not. Not yet, Ida Barnes." The engine turned over, but it wasn't starting. "Uncle Arthur! He would help. He wanted to look after her. Where was he? He couldn't have gone far. Uncle Arthur!" She had time. She dashed back through the house, but the street was empty. He'd gone. He hadn't seen what had happened. Ida's face was wet with tears. Her cheeks stung in the cold wind. She ran back through the house to the alley. But the car was pulling away. She tried to grab the bumper, but she couldn't. She ran after it as it bumped over the cobbles. "Stop! Stop! You can't take my sister!" she shouted. But the driver picked up speed as it reached Trinity Street. It turned right towards West Street, and Ida dropped to her knees. "No!" she cried. One or two of the neighbours came through their back gates to see what the fuss was about. There, Ida. It's for the best," said Mrs. Allonby, taking Ida's shoulders and gently helping her up. "It isn't," said Ida, in a voice almost too small for Mr. and Mrs. Allonby to hear. Mrs. Allonby smelled of too much carbolic soap and the coal from her bunker, not like Mum at all. She led Ida back up the alley, which was properly dark now, to Ida's lonely house. The stones hurt Ida's feet through Mum's slippers. Ida hadn't noticed that before. Mum's words, "Look after Bonnie," echoed round her head. How could she have let Mum down so soon? Just this one thing she had asked, and Ida had torn it. She refused Mrs. Allonby's fussing in the politest way she could. "If you're sure, dear," Mrs. Allonby picked up her full coal scuttle. "I'll collect my cups and saucers tomorrow. You get some sleep now." Ida closed her back gate. She sat down on Bonnie's chair and in the dim kitchen gaslight, huddled over the open door near under the range, where the coals were smouldering red. The cups could wait. Somehow she'd get Bonnie out of the horrible Netterfield Grange orphanage and away from the even more horrible Mrs. Buller, if it was the last thing she did.